I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. On a night like this in Minnesota, it means a lot to have folks come inside. So thank you so much. And I'm so excited for tonight's lecture and the event. So I think we're in for a treat. My name's Tom Evers. I'm the executive director with the Minneapolis Parks Foundation. I'm just thrilled to see everybody here. I do have to say this, for those Star Wars fans, happy Star Wars Day. May the Force be with you. Those who don't know, that's fine. Don't worry about it. This is the Next Generation of Parks event series. This is our 11th year, and it's really about bringing some amazing thinkers, designers, activists, advocates to Minneapolis to share with us what they're learning and what they're doing for us to think about when they leave. The event is produced in partnership with NPR News and Mill City Museum, so appreciate that partnership. And a special thanks to our Next Generation of Parks event series sponsors, Bar Engineering and the Minneapolis Foundation. We can't do it without them. And that, in addition to our donors, many of you are donors to the Minneapolis Parks Foundation, it allows us to make these events free. That is one of the guiding values of the Next Generation of Parks events, is they're free and open to the public. We really appreciate all that support. Before we begin the program, I just want to take a few minutes to first off share a little bit about the Minneapolis Parks Foundation, and then share with you a brief video to kind of highlight the significance of the place where we are right now. Minneapolis Parks Foundation is an independent nonprofit, and our mission is to transform human lives through parks and the public realm by aligning community vision and philanthropic investment. We work closely with many public partners. Our enduring partner that we continue to work with is the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board, which is the agency responsible for operating this amazing park system. It's unique in Minneapolis that we have an agency that's independently elected that owns and operates all our parks. We work with them to bring to life a vibrant and healthy and aspirational park system that serves everybody, and that is our vision. Because we do believe that parks have the power to heal us, to connect us, to make us whole. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Parks Foundation, and we are setting out an ambitious vision for our future. We'll be sharing more of that in the months to come, weeks and months to come. But we're also really proud about some of the significant achievements that we've accomplished over the past few years, and many of you have contributed to that, including Waterworks just down the road here, the Overlook, which is up on the river, the 26th Avenue Overlook, and many different investments, community activation and innovations through the People for Parks Fund over the past couple of years, and many, many other things that we do, but those are some I want to highlight. We know that great parks make great neighborhoods. We know that great neighborhoods weave together to make great cities. And while we celebrate all the varied benefits of Minneapolis's nationally renowned, locally treasured system, the Parks Foundation really focuses our work on elevating our work through these 5 outcomes. We're looking at parks because we know that they have the power to advance equity and cultural inclusion. We know that they can foster community health and well-being. We know that parks deepen connections to the natural world. They strengthen our ability to address climate change and climate resiliency, and they can spark economic vitality. And that's where we lean in those areas. To look forward, though, we also must reflect on the past and begin to heal as well. We stand on native land. In Minneapolis, this land was the home to the Dakota, the Anishinaabe people, and many other indigenous nations. Our city was born of trauma, and we've made intentional decisions to add to that harm by exclusion, racist land policies, and outright violence. Those are facts. We owe it to ourselves and the generations yet to come to begin to work of that healing. Parks have that power. Before I introduce our program, I want to share a short video that was created in partnership with the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Board, the Minneapolis Park Board, and Natives, which is a Native American-centered project nonprofit focusing on indigenous food systems. Our own Jeanette Law here did the work in pulling it together, and it's one that will be shared at Waterworks. And Waterworks just down the road here is one of the projects that we wanted, thinking about stories. It's more than just a park. Waterworks is really coming to represent an opportunity for us as a city to retell the story of this place. Where we see in each other the promise, we know that this is a place where language and culture hold the same power as brick and stone, where we see in each other the promise our cities can truly deliver. As we stand on this sacred site of Owamini, we want to make space for language that accompanied the falls and filled the landscape before the buildings lined the riverbanks. So I'm going to share a little video that will be at Waterworks. It's a 2.5 minute video.
Midakuyepi, chante washtea napet chiuzapia. Dakotia wakayan kewi emakiapi, washuchuya Liz emakiapi. Bere wakantoa Dakota Himacha, naku bere ota Edwati, dayan wachiankapi. Hello, my name is Liz Cates. I work at Natives, that's North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, and I am a Dakota language learner. Makocha kinde Dakota tamakoche. Watoto kihana gawama kashka kihana Dakoti api ogachni kapi. Dakoti api cha makaki unyu onihampi. Ga Dakota oyate ki ungohodapi. Ehanaka dehan Dakota oyate ki dechia tipi. Dakota oyate ki hachatuan oyate ki ga hotanka oyate ki oas dechia Owamini uomini ded uitayapi ga watokio peapi. Owamini uomini tawa ikiha hacha wakpa wabadaka wachi ga maniki nawahu wachi. Cha ki hana wabadaka wachi ga wakbe ki yusnasna nawahu wachi. Oyate ki chaje ki Owamini uomini ayabiki nawahuachi. Dakota iabiki unspe ichichia shkampi. Makoche dachia otueki ga wakbaki, ga bereki, ga bahaki, dakod chaje ki unspe ichichiapi. Makoche kinde ga Dakota wichochan ki owanjida. Doket ked o eti ga achapi, ga doket ked heake ga achapi, ga doket ked wakuapi, o wastunu yapi, I chinsted untipi. He un Dakota wichocha ga Dakota iapi ki o wanjidan. Iapi ki heche daku o was un gaberesapi.
There are stories here that we need to allow to emerge, and parks have a power to do that. And it's true that land holds a multitude of truths, and like history, it is a kaleidoscope and multifaceted. Just as this land and our parks tell those stories of pain, they're also places where healing can begin, and that's really what tonight is to begin to thinking about. These shared places, our parks, have the power to help us, heal us, make us whole. And that's why I'm just so excited about tonight's program and our speaker, José González. Really thrilled. It's thinkers and designers and advocates who will help, like José, who will help show the way for us. While we're rich in stories, some have not been told yet widely. There's still more stories that we've not heard, and some that have not been created yet. So we owe it to ourselves to nurture those stories and to create spaces for cultures, for languages and traditions and histories to become infused in the land and to seed our future. And I believe that this is what this is about. To do the honors of introducing José, I am pleased to introduce our host and interviewer tonight. As I mentioned earlier, we are really fortunate to have the partnership with Minnesota Public Radio. If you've been to a Next Gen lecture before, you know how much they contribute. And we have that again tonight with Jacob Aloi to facilitate the discussion after José's presentation. Jacob and he will also introduce Jose. Jacob is an arts reporter for NPR News. He was previously involved in performing arts, podcasting, community radio before coming to NPR News. We're thrilled to have his talents tonight to help host the conversation. After the conversation, after the presentation, and then there'll be an interview, there's cards, and if you want to fill those out, we'll pass them forward, and we'll use those for the conversation as well. So with that, Jacob.
I'm gonna stand here and do it if that's all right. To answer the questions, yes, I am this short in person, because this might be the first time you're seeing my face. So hello, I was once described as the other arts guy at NPR News, so I'm really happy to be here tonight in front of all of you. But I'm very excited to be introducing tonight's speaker. José G. González is the founder of Latino Outdoors and the co-founder of the Outdoors to Oath. He is a professional educator with training in the fields of education and conservation while engaging in different artistic endeavors with art and messaging, often exploring the intersections of the environment and culture. As a partner in the Averna Group and through his own consulting, his work focuses on equity and inclusion frameworks and practices in the environment, outdoors, and conservation fields. He is also an illustrator and science communicator. He received his BA from the University of California, Davis, and his MS at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. His teaching coursework was at the Bilingual Multicultural Education Department at Sacramento State, and he serves as a trustee for the National Outdoor Leadership School, a trustee for the National Recreation Foundation, and Outdoor Industry Association Board Director, among other leadership and volunteer roles. We're very excited to have you tonight. Everybody, José G. González.
Dale, man. Gracias. Appreciate it. Sweet. All right. Should I cue it up, or we always rely on Christine? Gracias, Christine. So I'm setting it up. I think I have the mic all set up, so audio-visual, you'll let me know. And I'll start by saying gracias. It's really great to be here with you all. I want to honor a couple of things. The first one, as was mentioned earlier, you dedicated time to be here. And whether it's here in person right now or watching this recording later, I often say, like, time is that precious currency that you get to choose how to spend it. So thank you. Along with the irony, as we were talking about, that usually we're working to get you outdoors, and tonight, I know we're resisting you being outdoors to come indoors. And then second, of course, really want to honor the offering connected to a land acknowledgement. I'm reminded of two things. One is an elder once shared with me that when you are gifted with the old words, especially if you're gifted and you're being invited to be able to share those, it's really special, because I remember they said the land loves to hear the old words. So in that variety of what's offered. And then likewise, that I think in this aspect of healing, a lot of what I will share is how to weave all of this together, knowing that that difference that we all hold plays a role in the work that we're doing, much like the biodiversity that we're often really striving to protect. So José González, as you heard, although it's José Guadalupe Adonis González Rosales, with a little bit of the León. That is what's on my birth certificate. He, him, his, though I'll respond to anything offered with joy and respect. And I greet you. I traveled here from ancestral, traditional, stolen, unceded, and occupied lands of the Nisenan, Southern Maidu, Miwok, among many others. What is at the moment Sacramento, California, Sacrastan Califas. And I'm excited to be here with you all because even with me sharing my name was the start of my journey to be able to, and I forgot to say, and I consent to you tagging me on social media, so have at it if you are into it and interested and quote and all of that. It's right there for you. And so I start with the saying of my name because I wasn't even Jose until coming to the United States. So I was born in the state of Nayarit in Mexico, and I was Lupe, so Jose Guadalupe, named after my dad, like many other firstborns. And so I was Lupe came to the US, and then now I had to be Jose because the school system said, well, what is your first name? Well, I guess technically it's Jose. Okay, well, that's what you need to go by. And I was like, okay. So half of my family still calls me Lupe from Mexico, and the rest will call me Jose. And then little by little, I eventually had to navigate structures or institutions like the Department of Motor Vehicles, for example. And they're like, well, what's your last name? What's González Rosales? All right, so that means, got it. González Rosales, that means Rosales is your last name. That's your dad's last name, right? Well, no, it's my dad's last name is González because it's paternal, maternal in Mexico. Well, no, you have to pick one. And if you come from Mexico or probably other countries in Latin America or even other countries where you have similar structures, you know what that's like. You're like, well, why can't I just be what the name on my birth certificate is? And so as a kid, I just was figuring out how to conform to how I fit in. That was part of what I call my journey of cultural wayfinding. And then it wouldn't be really until college that I began to understand how that played a role in what I now talk about. We navigate these structures. We listen to social cultural markers that say, yes, you can be that, no, you can't be that, and then be able to ask why. Right? So I start there because when we talk often about the value and benefit of lived experience, it's being able to say, how is somebody's journey? How is that expertise? It might not come with a degree, but it's expertise that can be a value add often to a lot of the work that we do when we're inviting it in that way. Here I am running in the Organ Mountains National Monument, which was a recent, not this year, but a few years ago, national monument down in New Mexico. So we're trail running. I was accompanying a colleague who was still running through several national monuments. And I often think this is a good embodiment of that cultural wayfinding for me in terms of how do I get to decide who I'm going to be? I'm holding a little pañuelo bandana there from another friend from Arizona. As you can see, it's Saki, as I always will mispronounce it. It's one of the deities from the Nahuatl, from the Mexica in Mexico. I was wearing my sombrero with, of course, the technical gear that I needed to not die out in the in the sun. And that, for me, is kind of like that journey entry point into what eventually became Latino Outdoors, and then the work that I do now. And so growing up, by show of hands, how many of you know who that character is? A few of you, right? So if you don't know who that is, you can ask somebody that raised a hand. Chapulín Colorado, who part of the lore is that this was the inspiration for the bee-man character in The Simpsons. So I grew up with what that culture was growing up as a kid in Mexico and then later coming to the US and taking in some of that Spanish media. And so the Chapulín Colorado often had a lot of these phrases like, no contaban con mi astucia, right? You weren't counting on my wit or astuteness or intelligence. And so I have no contaban con mi astucia científica, like with my scientific knowledge, because it was both for me, I liked school, I benefited from the public school system, and also that I thought about what does science mean, not just what I'm learning from books, but maybe from what my grandparents hold as scientific knowledge, but that may be different. And the other character from that show is El Chavo del Ocho, who lived in this barrel, kind of like a representation of living in poverty in el barrio. But also it's kind of like finding his own way. And I'm taking cada día, I'm shuffling to be cada día, I'm code switching. Because this code switching became such a core element of my cultural wayfinding that I still lean on to today. If you're familiar with this, code switching comes from linguistics, which literally means to switch codes in terms of that you can go from Spanish to English. So it's your classic pero like. Right? Pero like, that's code switching, which is related to but different than Anglicisms and a bunch of other things that we call Spanglish, which is its own conversation. But the code switching then, culturally, what that meant is how you show up in a space with your, how you communicate, your humor, your dress, your mannerism, all of these different elements. And so code switching for me early on was a means of survival, right? To be able to fit in. So I could be smart and nerdy at school, but then I was less of that when I was with my neighborhood friends. And then I was in one way like this with my Mexican friends, and then I was one way like this with my non-Mexican friends. It was adaptive. And so it also was adaptive because growing up as a kid in California, there were very few things that I received that said it was okay to be Mexican. It was just a lot of markers were like, you don't want to be that. And so I grew up with a lot of cultural shame as to, well, what should I be? And it wasn't until college that I really leaned into code switching for survival into code switching to thrive. So I said from surviving to thriving. And that's part of kind of what I lean into today. So as a kid, I would not wear my huaraches. That would just be like an indicator that, oh, you're poor from Mexico. But now I wear them as a connection to my hometown, to my grandpa, who this is all he wears. No matter where he's going, this is what he wears. He will be out, we can call it hiking, he just calls it walking, out in the hills for miles. And I was like, can I get you some hiking boots? And he's like, why would I want that? My feet are adapted to these huaraches. And so that's stuck with me. So I'm sharing a little bit of kind of how my lived experience was an entry point into the work that I do. And I'll go through all of these. As I go through these and a question pops up, jot it down. Right? Because I'm going to go through all these elements to show you how do we connect lived experience with research, with other ways of knowing, which is how, as individuals, we approach this work. Institutionally, we approach this work. And ultimately, for me, is systemic design and change. How can it be different? It can. And that's within our power to do so and not do so. So part of approaching this work, we think about systemic change, at least in these three elements: structural, relational, and then I call it conceptual, but you can think of it as transformative or mind shift work. And what it gets at is to be able to say, if we want different systems, what are the structural elements that are most explicit? You can kind of tell if they're there or not. Do you have the policy to be more inclusive? What does that look like? Do you have a budget for it? Can you point to a budget and be able to say, yeah, we think this is going to happen because the money's actually there? Versus, we said it's important, you look at the budget, it's nowhere in there, you can't be surprised that it won't move. Relational, semi-explicit because it's there, and you have to probably tease it out a little bit or figure out what do we mean by that. So something like power dynamics. Sometimes we love to talk, say, well, there's power dynamics in the room. Okay, great. Show me. What does that look like? And that's when you can sit down and be like, well, okay, there can be power dynamics in terms of a title. Someone is the director, right? Someone is the one that makes the final decision versus someone that doesn't. That it could also be what we'd call structural privilege, like based on gender. Someone's going to be heard more than somebody else. And this isn't just in somebody's, mind, so to speak. You can look at case studies, right? Even at the Obama administration, at that top level of the White House, you had documentation of how women had to amplify each other to counter the fact that men were being paid attention to more. And so I'm like, so if it's happening there, I can't be surprised how it shows up in all its other spaces. So that's the type of power, right? I say something, and somebody goes like, yeah, that's a great idea. But she just said it like a minute ago, right? Why is that different? There is a reason, but we'll get into that. Transformative change is that those mental models, the mind shift. It's the most implicit because it can be a little hard to tease out. And usually you really want to get in conversations, ask those questions like, why do you think that way? And for me, it's not about aggressively saying, you're wrong, you should think differently. It helps me understand the perspectives, the model that you hold that can show up as to how how you show up to support some of this or be more resistant to it, and why. And what can it take to move you from one space to another? Understanding that it's not as easy as just by telling you, well, you're wrong. Just be different. Think different. It's not that easy. So what I'll be sharing, a lot of what I'll continue sharing will fall in these elements. And we're starting by, as was mentioned, some realities that we ground this in. There's a demographic inevitability for this country. It'll show up differently across some states or with some urban areas. Me in California, the demographic titled Latinos it's the plurality. It's the biggest demographic group in the state. The question is, what does that representation mean in decision making and spaces of power, and how that shows up in different elements? But the reality is that the demographics of 2050 are going to be different than 1950. And that can be exciting, that can be value add, that can add a lot of thrivability. And it's dependent on how much we're prepared for that and embrace that versus we resist it. Knowing that resistance doesn't mean it's going to magically go away. And so with this, it affects not just representation, but actual power in terms of decision making that affects all of us. This is from the Greenlining Institute. Because sometimes when we say, well, it's DEI work, and we hear that term, we're like, oh, there's that term again. Some of us have bad experience with that term for one reason or another. Or it's like, oh, that means I can tune out. Or that means it's not important. And for me, actually, it says, no, this is an integrated way. Everything from leadership development, from programmatic development, from you name it. DEI is just an acronym, or DEIJ, or whatever the acronym that you use. For me, it's more about pay attention and what's the invitation, the action, to redesign differently so that the value add of difference is great for all of us. Because as an example in the US, we can find historical points as recent as the 1960s, so this is just a generation away, where we had very overt, discriminatory structural elements. So like a law, policies, signs on the door that said, if you are white, this is for you. If you're not white, this is not for you. That's for you, maybe. And that's what I mean about structural, overt, discriminatory policies. And we could change the law, but that doesn't immediately mean that the other elements flip just like that. You have to do work around the relational pieces. You have to do work about the mind shifts. And we're still in the process of that because it's still just within a generation. But even as these demographics are shifting and we go from tolerance to be like, well, the law's different, so now we can't overtly discriminate through policy with one group or different groups. We're trying to then embrace what can difference mean in kind of I think of it as the food, fun, and fiesta type of way to say, yeah, difference is great. And we're like, okay, yes, thank you for seeing me, and do I get a say in how things are actually run? Not yet. Because you still, power spaces were still predominantly decided by the demographics of the past. But again, as the demographics change, you have to embrace the reality that from the 1990s into now you start getting elected officials that are very different. On boards, as head of organizations. And that can be an opportunity to really be able to lean into and say, not just the representation, but the responsibility of governing with that difference to continue to be inclusive for all. And it's easy to say, but the practice of it is the one that's hard for us, and that takes that active nurturing work. So I share this so that what I say today isn't just like, well, I had this idea and I think it's neat and we should do it. I approach this as like, this is part of the reality that we want to be active on to redesign differently. And so that when many of us that do like nature axis, outdoor axis, environmental, diversification of the conservation movement, whatever, however we approach it, we get really excited when we engage with intentional users. Somebody that already kind of has a foot in the space is like, oh, you like hiking too? I like hiking too. And you're very different than me, so yay. Because it feels good. And this doesn't make it bad. It's more about if we're only focusing here and then we forget this other part of the spectrum, we can miss opportunities to do deep structural healing work. Because you may have intentional non-users that can say, I'm not interested. Hiking's not for me. That can be true for any of us. We can all have preferences in terms of what we like and don't like pineapple on a pizza, which I'm sorry, but it's great. And with jalapenos. Right, we can say, well, those are personal preferences. That can be true. And what we might miss is that people might have a reason to tell you no because it's easier to tell you no than engage in trauma again or realize you're not really interested in doing the deep structural work for it to be different. That there's reasons why a community or family may say, we don't go into the woods for a reason. We don't go to that space to hear the story of this land told in this way for a reason. We don't go to this place because of who is there doing the enforcement of that place. And this is where some of that work lies in there. And so as we do this and we want to work on the spectrum of engagement, we can then begin to unpack some of this. We can bang to things like, hey, we're going to design a new park, redesign a new park, whether it's an urban park, it's a rural park, it's an in-between park, it's a park that focuses on stewardship or protecting the biodiversity, whether it's a park that focuses on more recreational opportunities. We can approach by asking some of these questions. So this is from the Outdoor Industry Association via the Outdoor Foundation. And I share this just so sometimes people ask, well, what's some of the data? And with data, you always want to look at different sources of it to be able to see what stories it tells you. Because this can tell one part of the story, such as you're able to say, okay, well, I can see different groups are engaging in different ways, and yet what is considered the Black demographic is pretty low. And that might fit a narrative that say, well, maybe they're not interested in outdoor participation. And then we can look at something else like the 2017 Nature of American studies where they ask these questions. And one of them is, how would you rate your interest in each of the following activities? So what about your interest in hiking? And then you can see, all right, well, this is how these were reported. And they might say, well, interest in hiking lowest among Black adults because they're only showing up at 19% in the a lot category. And then we might say, well, what about your interest in walking outdoors? And all of a sudden, they all shoot up. So we can ask, well, what's the difference between hiking and walking outdoors? It's both rhetorical and not. Okay? Because we're able to say, if we're asking the body to engage more or less in the same ask, walking outdoors, what are we communicating that's different culturally? When somebody hears hiking and they say, oh yeah, not for me, and not just be for interest, but might be because every time I've tried it, I've gotten cultural enforcement that it's not for me, not just my preference. And so this is important sometimes when we approach the way that and I don't say just the semantics of it, but the power of the words in terms of cultural constructs or social constructs. And so for me, it recognizes the power of how we entered the space, but also our ability to change it, right? Because nature isn't out there telling us, hey, make sure that you tell people that it's hiking, not walking outdoors, right? We're the ones doing that. And so this is when we founded Latino Outdoors 10 years ago. This was part of how we were trying to approach it to be not just like what term do we use, a strategic choice to use the word Latino, but that we weren't trying to say, this is it, like this is the only way you can engage. Rather more, how can this be an entry point to the variety and diversity of the identity along with the variety and diversity of the outdoors? And so whether you used any of these terms or others, we wanted to be able to say, can this be a space for you too? And if you don't feel that, we'd love to work with you to make it so. Knowing that it's growing. Right? There's no magic book that we get and it's like, congratulations, this explains everything about Latinidad. And it's not. But for me, it's an invitation to explore how can this identity, for me, be healing, and then be able to use that as an entry point to anybody that would self-identify with an aspect of that identity and say, let's co-create this space. And so sometimes, not sometimes, but when I introduce myself with some of these terms, I say, I'm Mexicano by birth nationality, I'm Latino by social cultural identity, I'm Chicano by social political identity, and I'm Hispanic by census count. And those can all be true. And so for this next piece, it was, how did my cultural wayfinding connect with kind of the outdoors and nature, with like how I wanted to approach a relationship to the outdoors and nature that both wove with my cultural wayfinding, that included kind of my own reconnection to indigeneity as a way to also redefine my relationship with the land, while also honoring, you know, the difference and diversity of other communities that I would be in community with. So this is kind of like my Michael Pollan attempt at like capturing that sentence. If you don't know what I'm referring to, you know, see who laughed, and then you can ask them. Kind of like eat food, not so much, and yeah, that kind of stuff. Because I wanted us to start with the statement that would be an entry point for me to unpack a lot of how I approach this work. So like my thought paper, Healing Severed Connections, like this was the anchoring for it. Be with nature as nature in radical and revolutionary balance. It was the invitation to be with nature. Like go outside, right? Hug that tree. Lay on the grass. Go for a walk. Smell the flowers. Talk to the crows. All of these elements, like there's a lot of research that says it's good for you to be out there. As nature was that reminder that we've developed a history of considering ourselves as humans separate from nature. That's not true for a lot of other communities. A lot of indigenous native tribal communities of the US, they're like, well, we don't have a separate word for nature, it just is. And you can understand why some will say, you know, when they get asked, well, what's more important? Is it the language, the culture, the land? Like, what is it? And like, those are all the same thing. Right? They're woven in that aspect. And in radical and revolutionary balance was for me to say, how can I be disruptive in a way that changes system, but also allows me to be in this healing space? So by radical, when you think of the word radical, does anyone know what the root of the word radical is? What's that? Roots, right? And if you read ahead, that's totally cool too, so don't worry about it. But that's where I started too, which was like radical as like, let me look at that as like radical, and it's like raíz. It's roots. And so I was thinking, all right, so what can radical be not as this external outside force that is often seen as like coming in, but rather how can I be radical by being rooted in the work right here? What is the root work of this? So I am radical by being grounded. And similarly for revolutionary, it's those revolutions. Una revolución is a cycle. And so I was thinking, how can I be revolutionary in a way that means being a part of and supporting regenerative cycles, which the land, which nature holds? Because it's when we are disruptive of those cycles, or when we create cycles of harm, that we get in trouble. So like climate change being a disruption of one of the biggest cycles, which is the carbon cycle. But we look at all these ways in which nature attempts to be efficient and sustainable, and then we as people might think, well, we can do better, or let's not pay attention for a while, and then we pay the price in a decade, in 2 decades, in a generation, or in 500 years. But for me, the opportunity still says that nature said, we can still heal. Even during, when the pandemic started and we shut down a lot of things, nature was like, I got this, right? It's like, listen, here it is. But do you want to work with me or against me? That was part of that question. Unfortunately, I think we're not answering that question very well. It's my opinion. But that invitation is still there. How can a pandemic be a portal? And do we step into and through that portal and into what? Versus saying, nope, thank you, now let's just go back to what it was. And then as we do this work, sometimes the conversation comes up that people say, well, we still got to be guided by the science. I was like, tell me what that means for you. It was like, oh, like gathering data and research. I'm like, I hear you. This isn't meant to be exclusive of that. It's for me to be able to say, I don't want that to be the dominant or the default that's the only thing that prescribes value. And then we miss other opportunities, other ways of knowing, other ways of being, other knowledge systems that can also tell us a lot. And sometimes we're not surprised that Western European science then comes around and says, yeah, they were right. And so I'm like, let's look at what that looks like. So this is from the National Science Foundation. It was a project that they funded called the Cosmic Serpent. And so I refer this, I'm like, here's a perfect example of when you had quote unquote Western Eurocentric science, worldview, so science from that approach. And they gathered with native elders and other native scientists to be able to say, like, look at how these can work together. How can they complement each other? And even the final report that they presented had that invitation to say, if you want to read this report in this way, here you go. Here's this kind of linear, what you're used to, here are the pages. And if you want to read this report in this way, here's how you can cycle through it. Right? Here's how you can now move through this differently. So this leads me then to the investigation of the logics that set up this. I know, here's like that C word. You say, oh, it's the C word, just like the R word. Can we talk about it? Yes, don't be scared. You're not being indoctrinated unless you choose to. That's also a joke. So, because I often look at this to do at least 2 things. The first one is be familiar with what the conversations that are happening, so then I can see what my role is. What part do I play? And I might not always have the fluency of the language, but at least I can have an awareness so that I'm not surprised, or at least so that I'm complicit in the good stuff and not complicit in the bad stuff. So this is Dr. Rupa Maria. She presented this at 2018 Pioneers, I believe. And it's very popular because people can then see, like, yeah, there it is. Here's all the interconnected systems of harms. This is like all the stuff that we talk about that we don't want. We don't want racism, sexism, patriarchy, like you name it. And so sometimes I think of this as like the things we're fighting against. But then the writer Michelle Holliday was saying, well, colonization can be a driver, right? It can be a starter, igniter, a catalyst of some of this, or even a foundation. But even what is the logic that pushes that? And that's where you can unpack it as this kind of mechanistic reductionist worldview, by which we mean that I take something and then I reduce it as kind of objectify it as a piece that I can then rationalize extracting it or using it for my benefit. And how can I do that to each other and to the land? It's the rationale in which then I treat another person, right? Create a whole hierarchy that then devalues them so I can use them just for the labor, as an example. Same thing for the land. How can I take a forest and just value it for the trees as wood, the utility of it? So I'll come to some examples of this. And an invitation to play and think differently. Because if we flip it to a life-honoring worldview, then often I say this is kind of what we're fighting for. Not just against, but also what we're fighting for. And often a lot of this language is What shows up in our ecological, nature-based work? Thrivability, equity, stewardship, nature's abundance. All of these elements then we often see in the research as well as the lived experience of people that say, hey, nature is not just like for recreation, it has all these health benefits. Here's kind of part of how it can be a part of our educational system where we gain wisdom for it. All of these elements can come at play. And so I share this because, it's one thing to say, well, okay, this looks interesting and nice as a model. What does that mean in terms of like the reality of where we live? So redlining maps. How many of you here by show of hands are familiar with redlining maps? It's a lot of hands, right? It's kind of become one of the best documented examples of when we talk about like structural racism. We have this documentation. And it's a really good example of when we talk about structural elements versus just individual preference. That it wasn't black families, for example, saying, well, I want to live over there instead of here. You had push elements to say, no, you can only afford to live in there because we are not going to give you the loan. And then the person who is going to give you that loan is going to discriminate against you. The documents on the house say, if you are of whatever this background or this skin color, the house cannot legally be sold to you. And so these redlining maps were about housing. And what a lot of the research has shown is that you pick other aspects, and they correlate very strongly to this redlining map. So it's not just about housing. It's about health. It's about nature access. It's about all of these other elements that provide livelihood. So it's more than just housing. In this case, here is emergency department visit rates. So how often do you visit the emergency department? And so here you can see kind of the examples. The top are the redlining maps, the bottom are visit rates. And down right to when we talk about parks and nature access, this is from Science, the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban environments. In other words, redlining maps and the nature that you get. Because you can take the redlining maps, there's Minneapolis for you right there, number 5. And then be able to look at, say, how does this impact something like the nature, the non-human kin and the land that's accessible to you. And so you can look at the way in which you get reduced biodiversity and so reduced connection to ecological diversity, basically based on where you lived on these maps. So that's an example in which I say the maps we've inherited, if we don't redesign them, then we complicitly and implicitly may be continuing them on and dealing with the effects of them if we're not also structurally thinking about every time we get an opportunity to break that redlining map to have all these other outcomes. And so that it isn't just about housing, it's about all of these other elements. Sorry, audio technician people. And so I want to get to my kind of like ending points. What this has looked like in terms of how I both approach the work now and honor the work of Latino Outdoors and other groups is to take all of these elements in consideration. And so here's one in terms of kind of that mind shift. We sometimes might take Latino communities and always think, oh, they're new. Like we're always new immigrants. And it may be very true that you have some immigrant communities, while also acknowledge that other communities have been here historically in many different ways. And that there's a reason why considering you always new has benefit, but also has impact of harm. So Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. Who here is familiar with kind of like, you hear Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and there's a story that begins to fill your mind? Couple hands, right? Yeah. So for those of us who kind of went through an environmental studies track in school, we hear this again, I say this not to devalue her work because I'll say this, she went through some crap being a woman, trying to be clear about the harm of pesticides. Right? So this is a both and, not a either or. But this begins to tell a story. Here is a character, part of the story, that says we got to do something, because if we don't do something, we're going to have silent spring. So, for example, the use of DDT is killing birds. We should protect them. And the story that comes out of this is one of success. Like, we did it. So this is from 1997. So 25 years after 1997, this is kind of the story that came out of that, which was, like the founders of EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, brought the original DDT lawsuit in Suffolk County, New York, where they showed that ospreys were having poor reproductive success and eggs that had not hatched contained high concentrations of DDT, and this lawsuit ultimately led to the ban of DDT. And it's an environmental win, and a deserved one, because if we had continued using DDT, it'd be terrible for the environment. So it's a win. And what I invite us to say, how can it be incomplete in a way that doesn't honor all of the characters of the stories that may not see themselves reflected as part of the environmental and conservation movement? So at the same time that, and I don't expect you to read all this, don't worry. At the same time that Environmental Defense Fund was bringing this lawsuit, there was another lawsuit, another DDT lawsuit in California. Brought about by California Rural Legal Assistance, CRLA. They are less known and less funded than EDF. And in conjunction with the United Farm Workers, they brought this lawsuit on behalf of 6 migrant farm workers. I think it was, and a few of them were pregnant moms. To be able to say, like, yo, this DDT is messing us up. So EDF, interested in wildlife impacts, continue to have difficulty establishing standing in cases that require plaintiffs to be directly impacted by pesticide use. So for example, people, farm workers. Because back then, and even now, it's hard to prove that nature has standing in court. In some spaces that's changing, but it was basically the birds, you can't come on behalf of the birds. Like the birds don't have standing in court. But people do. And so you ended up having this marriage of convenience where these lawsuits were actually brought together. But rather than having it really be a powerful union of kind of redefining the strategic use of pesticide, it was a missed opportunity. The CRLA lawsuit helped the EDF lawsuit, but it didn't go the other way around. And it wasn't even until, even 10 years ago, that you have farm workers still fighting with some of the impacts of pesticides, if not DDT, others. And so it was this question of being able to say, so when CRLA turned the case over to EDF and it brought about an environmental win, why did it not also bring a farm worker win? And so this is when we get into those questions of like semi-explicit relational elements like power. Because it's a metaphor for the larger power struggle that such a subaltern group as farm workers had the audacity to challenge agribusiness methods. So these are the elements that I often say that we might invite a farm worker community and treat them as if like, let us bring you into outdoor recreation, from a paternalistic saviorism model, like pobrecitos, like we were here to help. Rather than be like, wow, you have been part of this work, and without your involvement, we wouldn't have had this major environmental win. Very different to honor them. And so that's how sometimes I approach this work, as how can I be inclusive of the expertise and leadership already present in a community. So here's the books if you're more interested in following up and reading about them. And so I look at how do I connect these elements, kind of a conservation cultura. What are ways in which we've always had a history of this work, It may look different, have looked different, and so forth, but we have been a part of it. And so if, mi mamá or mi papá, they're like, would never call themselves conservationists, I can understand why. While also being like, we always joke, ¿verdad? You go to the fridge, and what's in the butter container? It's not butter. Right? Frijoles or salsa. I was like, here we are reusing. We have conservation behaviors. And we might approach them from different entry points, but they still can have that impact if they're valued as such. And now it's like, wow, growing up, we would get in trouble if we were growing nopales in the front and had chickens in the back. But now, it's a hip thing to do. Heck, nopales are a superfood. Just goes to show you. So elements like this, for me, this is one of my early art watercolor pieces, was to be able to say it can be a cultural element, a hook, to be like, oh yeah, that looks interesting. It's like a Mesoamerican codice. That looks familiar. And oh, I see you're being playful with like the recycling logo. And it begins the entry to a story to say, you take the Mexica or the quote unquote Aztecs, and they had a zero waste society. They're like, how do you design a city in the middle of a lake bed to be sustainable in a way that didn't completely screw up the landscape? They had a zero waste society. Right? We call it now a sustainable practice of zero waste. They wouldn't call it that, they just call it, living, being. So how are those elements part of how we incorporate as we redesign, not go back 200 years, but redesign for the next 200 years? And so I approach these different ways to kind of use the cultural element as the connection and maybe even a hook with the quote-unquote conservation story. So if we're going to talk about the hydrological cycle or the water cycle, an endemic species and all these elements, we can start by this and people say, oh yeah, look, I recognize Tlaloc and that's like the god of water or rain, right? It's like, yeah, tell me more. And then we can begin to talk about endemic species like the little axolotl, or how humans can be part of, or integrated as part of this regenerative cycle. Or we were out with college students out in Yosemite, looking at these giant sequoias and saying like, these giant sequoias come from these very tiny seeds. If you've ever held a sequoia seed, they're tiny, fingertip. And then you look at the sequoia, biggest tree in the world, massive. And we ask them, where does the stuff of that tree come from? How does it go from this little seed to that big tree? And that's a science conceptual engagement question. Anyone know, by the way, where's the stuff come from? Saw a hand back there. Yeah. It's the carbon dioxide. And so we could look at that and say, little seed, big tree, little seed, big tree. And we're like, si se puede, right? And that clicks for them. Like, they get it. But then we can enter and talk about carbon sequestration. And when we talk about forests as carbon sinks and all of these elements, but also get to help them think of themselves, what do I take in? What feeds me going from a seed to a big tall tree? And the penultimate part, so fires, for example, of us in California and other nearby states have been traumatic. And this is kind of like funny, not funny element. That's a perfect representation of it. But it's been a really good connector between the work that we do in nature and kind of, I think, the language of ecology with social justice work, that they have a relationship. Because our current fires are intensive and destructive. And as my friend who's a professor at Stanford says, like, those are our past practices have caught up with us, compounded by climate change. And by past practice, it's meaning suppression. Overly Smokey the Bear messaging. No offense to Smokey the Bear. It's more about like that. Any fire, you put it out. Fire is bad, right? You see smoke, put it out. But what that did is create the conditions now for any spark creates this intense destruction. And we suppressed ancestral practices, for example, of prescribed burn. We've ignored the history of native people saying, no, we used to set fire to the land. And us thinking like, oh no, that's terrible. Why would you do that? and missing the reality that some of these are fire-adapted ecosystems that need fire. So not just the natural fire of lightning, but also some of the tending creative fire. And so we've built these conditions to be destructive. And so when you have low-intensity fire, good fire, it creates the space for healthy succession, for the good things, the healthy things to grow. And so as we're kind of reconnecting with these practices, I often say, so for our social, cultural, or relational spaces, I said, what prescribed burning do we need there? Because if we're suppressive about it, if we pick up any tension or conflict or things that we want to ignore because we're thinking, oh no, let's not talk about that. Let's not engage in that necessary healing work. Then later say, well, what happens now when a spark shows up? And then we're like, where'd that come from? And so that's an example in which I connect this and say, what prescribed burning do I need in my relational space today, this week, for this project, for this program, for this whatever it might be? And sometimes I don't know, but at least asking the question will not make me ignorant of like thinking that I'm conflict avoidant or resistant in a way that's unhealthy. And I'm not saying this to invite harm and conflict. It just allows me to be more expansive with the approach. And so the other example on this, when we talk about the mechanistic reductionist language compared to a life-honoring language, think about if one of you at work has heard the expression, your team is functioning like a well-oiled machine. How many of you have heard that before? A couple? Yeah, I've heard. I heard it not even knowing what it means as an English language learner, and then I finally got it. But it's like, yeah, you're doing a good job. Keep it up. You're being efficient. You're producing. Then if I went to you and say, hey, your team is functioning like a thriving meadow or like a well-nurtured meadow. Like, well, that sounds weird. Well, why is the machine better? And I'm not saying that machines are bad. I'm not here to be like, oh, no, don't think like that. It's more about what happens when we are expansive and now think like the meadow. What does that mean in terms of the leadership, of our relationships, of our outputs? Might there be times where function like a well machine be helpful? Yeah, like an emergency room. Might there be times, though, when we can pause and say, like, can we just meadow today? What happens? I have a few people at different workspaces that say, we've been using this, and it's been interesting to see what comes up. But that still goes into this element of thinking that just us saying it should be different, right? Lean into the hard work magically makes it happen, or that we naturally want to do this. So it can always helpful to have guides. This is from the Lawrence Hall of Science at UC Berkeley as examples that we might hear something and all of a sudden feel like, oh, that feels uncomfortable. Does that mean I'm part of the problem? Right? But I didn't. And so it helps us be able to pause and think, because we might ask ourselves, how does this lens change my understanding? And then fill in what I'm working on. How does this lens change my understanding of race dynamics in this community and beyond? And at least it gives me a different entry point, because we're not here to say you're perfect and you can't make any mistakes. That's just not being human. It's how do we work with that growth-oriented discomfort with prescribed burning for healthy succession versus just burn it all down or don't touch it. Right? Those binaries will tend to cause more harm than healing. And so to close, I'm just going to give you some quick examples in terms of like what this has meant for my work for me. This is another piece of my artwork. So it's the way that I think about how I show up in a space with kind of this ancestral energy and armor and healing. That doesn't automatically mean that I can't dress in different ways, that I can't hold other ways of thinking, but it helps me also remind me of how I can show up in some of these spaces, such as how we built Latino Outdoors for a variety of activities in different places, but also as an invitation to community. What this has meant in terms of like policy work across different levels of government, in different areas and places. So I never thought I'd spend so much time in Wyoming, for example, but just goes to show you. And what this has meant in terms of when I talk about those elements that are structural, relational, and mind shifts, and some of this is kind of that structural piece that matters. So in California, for example, I think in the US, but we've never had any form of resolution that said, hey, Latino, Latinas, Latinx community, you play a role in conservation. Imagine that. We have for a lot of other things. Heck, dogs are honored, sports are honored, you name it. But when it came to our community, we could find nothing that said, right, you matter. And sometimes people might say, well, it's a statement. But it goes back to those elements of the story that we talk about, to be seen and represented in this way. Funding, of course. I forget where Minnesota is in terms of an outdoor equity fund or grants or the like. A couple of states are picking us up. California was one of the first ones. We were able to allocate up to $100 million for outdoor equity. And that's just outdoor equity, let alone some of the outdoor funding. Research in terms of working with different universities to be able to look at, how do we frame this so that people can have something to point to when they're thinking, hey, what does this look like? And then to close, my very last slide is the Si Se Puede is a piece we often share a lot. And then we always add, pero hazlo. Right? Yes, you can, but do it. And that's kind of been some of the guiding work. So with that, gracias, and I think we'll be ready for Q&A.
Just a reminder, if you have questions, you do have those comment cards. So feel free to write one down, pass it forward, and hopefully I'll get to it if I have time. But first off, thank you again for presenting. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation and your lecture. I kind of want to start at the beginning of things and then work our way kind of through it. And as we go, questions hopefully will come in so that anything that you have in mind, I can be the voice to facilitate that.
Dale.
So the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about was a little bit more about how your personal story was your entry point into this. And I'm curious if you could explain how that process might begin for some of our audience members who obviously come from diverse backgrounds, come from different communities, are situated here in Minnesota rather than in California or in Mexico. And so I'm curious if you could give us some ideas or some tips or some pointers of how we could use our own personal stories to start to get into this sort of work.
So I'll frame this in 3 ways. The first one is you don't have to be, quote unquote, an expert in anything nature related or outdoorsy to go out and benefit from that experience. Just to be clear, you don't need to be like, shoot, I don't know any bird names. That's okay. You can also ask them and see, like, hey, ¿cómo te llamas? Go with that. And I also say that if you want to pick that up, go for it. But that should not be the first limiting thing. And so what that has meant in my lived experience and some of the families, we often start with questions. That it's okay to start with questions rather than presuming you have to know. You can start with 3 basic questions, which is, I notice. What do you notice? 2 is, I wonder. What does this make me wonder about? And 3 is, it reminds me of. What does that remind me of? I've asked parents and dads, be like, hey, look at that bird up there. What does that remind you of? And then they're like, oh, it's like this, this, and this. And they gave me like 5 different words for turkey vulture, which is very different if I just told them, by the way, everyone, that's a turkey vulture. And here's how you can tell how that's a turkey vulture. So that's the first one, because that's the lived experience they're bringing was my story, which was like, hey, that's a piece. The second is that for my lived experience it was just weird to go outdoors and feel this push and pull of like, we have a relationship to land. I grew up not hiking, but walking to school, which was rural, not camping, but sleeping out in the rancho. So it's not that was new, but camping in a tent in a particular way was new. I was terrified of lighting a stove for the first time, because like, what if it blows up? So that's the other lived story that honors your expertise while also being real about the fears that may seem unreal if you're already outdoorsy. People often say, oh, but what if there are bears? And rather than saying, there's been no bear here for like 100 years, we killed them all. I know, unfortunately. But you want to say, let's honor that versus just being dismissive of it. And then finally, the fun. We sometimes don't talk about the fun factor, and for me, it's being, what I try to do is, I call it joyful liberation, because we can have a lot of oppressive humor, right? That's just funny, and we're like, well, that's not funny, that's like putting someone down. But it can be a connector to people that I often say, there's reasons you have families say, para qué me quieres llevar a dormir, afuera? Like, that's what we don't want to do. Like, if I want to go hiking, I want to start at a hotel. And I said, I can understand that if you've come with an experience where the outdoors has meant labor for you. Mm-hmm. And so we try to expand, recognize and expand from outdoor labor to outdoor leisure and outdoor love.
I was going to say, as Latinos, often when I hear, at least when I think about hearing these things, people say, oh, Latinos, they don't go out and hike. And it's like, well, actually, Latinos are very connected to nature because so much of our story is connected to not only working the land, but now even in modern day, right? Yep. Being so many of us in America have backgrounds in migrant work or have family members who work in migrant work. And I was talking with a local artist, Luis Fitch, if anybody knows who that is. He did a whole piece this last year about the effects of climate change and how it's specifically affecting the Latino community because of people don't think about the people who, farm your land and make your food, how climate change directly affects those people who are working on farms, out in fields, in labor-intensive jobs.
First, hit worse, as we say.
Yes. So I'm curious too, and then we'll get to some audience questions in a moment here. Another thing that you brought up was culturally aware messaging, right? The idea of, because of these shared traumas and because of, as well as in other communities of color and other marginalized communities, it meant removal or it meant not getting access to these spaces. Yeah. So I'm curious, what can parks boards and organizations that are not founded in those traditions or communities, what can they do to kind of get at that messaging?
It's a good question because there's like no one single answer. It recognizes that. We say as Latinidad, we're this beautiful mess that holds a lot. And so it isn't just, well, let's just put signage in Spanish and that fixes it. You have to be able to ask, what do I know and not know about what quote unquote means, Latino, Latina in a community, so that I can understand what that equity gap may be. So as an example, you might realize, hey, really we have a community that might be a recent immigrant, and maybe Spanish is the language, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's an indigenous language from Mexico, and even Spanish is their second language. So do we have that as a resource, and if not, can we support it in some way? Others might be, before we even design the park already and then just plop it and then try to convince people to get there, if we have the opportunity to do participatory design and research at the beginning, we can then hear what they value and may not value that could both affirm and challenge some of the things we think they want. Might they want a soccer field? Maybe, but other times they don't. They're like, no, we're fine. How come we don't get a botanical garden in our community? So sometimes it's being able to listen as what's seeming contradictory. And then finally, the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley has this approach called targeted universalism, which is able to say the universalism is kind of what's our goal for everyone. So if you take all of Minneapolis, what do we want them to be able to have in terms of, let's say, parks? Right? Regardless of your socioeconomic background, of your ethnicity, you name it. So what's that goal? What's the universal goal? And then we're able to see, how does the community as a whole do in relation to that goal? Is it 5%, 10%, whatever it might be. Got it. So that's the starting point. And then we can look at the targeted element, which say, how wide is that gap for these different communities? So we're still closing the gap for everybody, while also not being ignorant that there's different equity gaps for different communities, so we can approach that differently while still saying there's a way we're serving all. And it connects equity and equality, with sometimes people put those at odds unnecessarily.
I'm wondering, we do have,
Yeah.
we do have one. Great, awesome,
Y en
thank you.
español también. A ver, si me sale mucho, pues ni modo, pero si tienen preguntas en español, le damos.
So for organizations looking to expand reach and find more resources, education and otherwise, where can they start looking to? Do they look inward? Do they look outward? I think it's kind of what the question's getting at.
Both. And what I would say is this. Even as I was looking at kind of the systemic change model in terms of structural, relational, and mind shift, you can look at that both from the individual to the interpersonal to the institutional. So you might find yourself in spaces where you're like, you know what, the structural institutional change in this space is hard. And it's gonna take me a bit of time. Can I start at the individual and interpersonal level? Because you'd be surprised. Within Latinidad, we got all kinds of stuff to still work out. We got to deal with anti-indigeneity, anti-blackness, like colorism, you name it. So there's a lot of work to do. You might also be in a position where you're like, actually, I have a couple levers of power that we can change this policy. That's structurally, if we do that, now we're setting up the conditions where we might then all of a sudden get applicants who are very different than before because we weren't even paying attention that that language was being exclusive in ways we didn't know. Or we just presume people weren't interested in applying versus not really noticing that they're looking at that and what they're receiving and saying, oh, that's not for me. So it's like, so that's what I mean about all across the board. And by now, we have so many more resources than we did even 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, that even with Latino Outdoors, our goal was to contribute that if you type in Latino Outdoors in the search engine, what you get is very different than 10 years ago. When I first looked at it, we're like, all right, so wait, where's everybody? I knew we were out there, but we weren't visible in that same way.
It was interesting you brought up, right, too, that part of that conception that organizations not looking or doing these things already or just starting to do these things come with these preconceived notions, right? For instance, thinking that all Latinos speak Spanish when there's a huge population that speaks French and a huge population like me whose first language is English and also Portuguese and indigenous languages. And so I'm just thinking about how, as a whole, what more can be done for everyone, even people within communities that aren't completely founded in anglicized Western traditions. What can be done to kind of change their thinking or their narrative or their definition of nature or the outdoors or access to those places?
So this is where I think some of the elements that I share that you can start by being able to look at and say, do I have a default model that then dictates how the rest folds out? In other words, and again, this is a both and. Even there, some of us maybe have never unpacked how often we do either or versus both and. Doesn't mean that there aren't either or options. It's just sometimes we realize, oh, that's a both and. What happens when I do both and? Even as simple as you might say something, and if I go, yeah, but, and then make my point, I might just say, well, I'm just debating. But the other person might be like, well, there's another damn microaggression because all I hear is like shutting down my ideas. Compared to if I said, yeah, oh, I like that, and it's how I'm now being additive and contributing. So it's just a little thing because sometimes people say, well, how could I start? But I would start with that logic so that sometimes, por ejemplo, we've built something like the Forest Service created an infrastructure of how to treat the forest in a particular way and value them. And that's not, on workers there now as if like, what's your fault? It's more about thinking, what can a shift mean in now relating differently if we move from natural resources to natural relatives as a way that's a native community might be saying, what happens now? You can still have utility of the wood. So, if you read Dr. Robin Wall Kilmer is braiding sweetgrass, you can still have utility of the wood. You can still make a pencil out of it, turn it into a house. And though it comes with an extra responsibility of honoring that relationship and having different guiding principles about now caring for the forest as a living ecosystem versus just utility of wood. So I say that. And then the second one would be that as we're starting, even at the community level, it's that power of invitation. You know, like, I'll go if you go, you're welcome. A lot of structural and tangible barriers like cost of transportation, of equipment, buying the pass, a lot of those are real. And often what people say is, I don't feel welcome or invited, or I show up and the first thing that I receive is that feeling of not belonging. So that power of invitation that we all hold is key, and that when we approach it, it's like an apology. The apology isn't about you. If you make it about you, then it's no longer an apology. I'm sorry that you felt that way versus I'm sorry I did that. So the power of invitation has to be centered on the other individual so that you don't approach it from that paternalistic saviorism model, like, oh, let me just convert you into how I'm outdoors, as opposed to like, I want to invite you and I'm excited to kind of learn how you experience the outdoors so we can have a both and.
I think it was interesting too, in your lecture, you talked about how there are cases where, you know, indigenous and non-Western thinking and Western thinking can complement each other. And there are certain situations where you want things to be a well-oiled machine and you want things to be a well-nurtured meadow. And so I just also wanted to make that point in there too. I'm curious, do we have anything else from the audience that has come in? If not, I have a couple, we have time for a couple more questions. So if somebody has one and wants to write it down really quickly, we can get to that as our last question. But in the in-between, I would say that another thing you brought up was this idea of binary things, right? It's one or the other. Touch it and leave it alone, or it all burns to hell, right? And so I think that is a really hard mental hurdle for a lot of people to get over, especially if you grow up in the U.S. where there's, you know, often there is no gray area, there is no in between.
We were founded in black and white.
Exactly, and so I'm curious to know if there are any suggestions as people have listened tonight and have learned and go out to do more of this and hopefully read some more of your work and read work of your contemporaries. What are some things to keep in mind to get over that hurdle specifically?
So I'll offer 3 examples. So one is, I talked about my own cultural wayfinding. So born Mexicano, came to the US, now I'm Latino. And having that sense of, well, you're bicultural. And because now you're both. And yet a predominant narrative is like, ni de aquí ni de allá, neither from here nor there. Well, now all of a sudden, you're not going to be Mexican enough for Mexico, but you're certainly going to be not American enough for the US. So we're like, okay, well, choose. And it felt like picking a language. Well, we'll learn English, and only English. I was like, well, why can't I be bilingual? And so I thought about that as an entry point to be, how can I be ambicultural in the same way that you can be ambidextrous? So that began my journey into that, and then I thought, well, how can I be quantum cultural? Like all these elements to try to hold the multitude of me. But an example is, because we sometimes say is being Latino, for example, is being colonizer and colonized. And so how could those both exist
coexist
in my
together,
identity?
right?
And so I think about, well, can my identity be an estuary? And so if you're familiar with estuaries, it's the place where the fresh water and the salt water meet. And ecology, that's an ecotone, right? And in ecotones, you have the edge effect. It's a zone of abundance. And so how can I think of my identity being this estuary as a zone of thrivability, of abundance, that also doesn't immediately become one or the other? It's neither purely fresh water nor purely salt water. It also has to be nurtured. I can't just expect it to exist just as is. And so that helps me to acknowledge there's a tension and flow, while also an active participation in the regeneration of that.
I just reported on a story about Hmong shamanism here in the Twin Cities, and all about holding multiple identities, right? Holding multiple cultural identities, holding multiple religious identities, and being able to get past that. And so very helpful to know that there are some ways that we can start thinking about that more. My last question that I have for you, and once again, I really appreciate you being here and with us. We obviously are here in Minneapolis, urban, urban as all urban can be. And it's great to get out to national parks and go out and drive, 200, wherever, 2 hours, 200 miles to somewhere where you can go and enjoy the wilderness or the outdoors and be unconnected. But I'm curious about what can be done in cities, right? What can be done in urban places to expand accessibility and also expand the space in which we can inhabit the outdoors.
So like this. By the way, I didn't get the questions ahead of time, right? They just feel like you set them up for me.
I am a journalist, so
No, I say this because, and I was having this conversation with a couple of colleagues earlier, we're trying to move away from this idea that access to just the outdoors, experiences, nature, whatever, is this pyramid, right? And like the very top is the best. Is what you really want to have, but you got to go those 200 miles way out there and then do 10 days backpacking and like do all this. It's like that's what you really want. And then like the less valuable ones are at the bottom. And rather flip that to be kind of a spectrum, just like a very vibrant, expansive rainbow that has everything from nearby nature, means like right outside your door, in your neighborhood, to faraway wilderness. And that's important because it keeps the connection, because there are times that we know the value of having some of these faraway wilderness experiences, but we also need to say, how does that help me restore elements in my neighborhood? So again, it's not an either or, so that even as Richard Lube from the Children in Nature Network says, how can we have nature-rich or nature-abundant cities? Because we can, but what does that look like? As well as knowing there are some faraway places like the Arctic Refuge, we don't want everyone going. Right? But we want them to be connected to that and care about it. So for me, that's that element that scares. So I would say be able to go out and walk around your neighborhood, see what you can identify, quote unquote, as nature, what might be you can actively participate in restoring. Maybe there is a local community group that does hiking and a local advocacy group, obviously the Parks Foundation. And begin that process to, again, be in nature as nature and yet in an urban setting. So I will even do that and sit down and I'll look at squirrels. I will watch crows like it's telenovelas. And if you haven't done that, I mean, if you know crows, I mean, they're obviously
they'll hold a grudge for life, right?
That's true. And I'll be conscious of that. Like, let me not get on a crow's bad side right now. Have conversations and do all of that. But it's that, being able to actively go and have micro adventures, have deep observation, and you'd be, I think for some people you can be surprised at the relationship you can have with nature in an urban setting as you increase your literacy of it. That's no different than when you go out into faraway mountains. And if you're disconnected, all you see is green and brown, and it's kind of like trying to read a music sheet with no knowledge of music. You're like, what is this? They're just scratches. And little by little, you begin to realize, oh, wait, that's this, that's that. This flows in this way. This communication is happening. And that is but one entry point into both scientific and ancestral wisdom. We had an elder once say, that she was just working on reclaiming some of that ancestral knowledge herself from her tribe. It's like we could listen to the wind in the forest, and that would tell us how healthy the forest was. Because if it was super packed, unhealthy forest, it would sound differently than if it had the right, separation between trees, which you can have a research project from a university come and tell you the same thing.
Well, thank you so much, José González. Yeah. I'm going to turn over the time back to Tom.
All right. Gracias.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Jose, thank you so much. There's so much to think about, Jacob. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Feel free to linger. We can visit. Hope you can come to more. We do have a couple things just to note that are coming up. There are walk and talks on June 6th at Minnehaha Park. Love to have folks join if you're willing and able. And then on June 22nd, we're having a pop-up dinner, surprise location, fundraiser for the Parks Foundation. So keep in touch. Next generation of Parks Lecture Series will begin again in the fall. Again, Jose, thank you so much, and Jacob, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again soon.